So the heart of the gospel is God's heart and his motive of why he gave his son's life for you. So we're looking at Jesus' call to his disciples. And this is 4 of them, 4 out of the 12 that we know of. Now understand this, in the Gospels it talks about disciples, there's different categories of disciples. These are his most immediate disciple. The word disciple just means a disciplined follower, someone that has committed themselves to follow the teaching of another. And in that day, it was a rabbi that they would often follow. And there'd be somebody would say, I'm a follower of Rabbi so-and-so, and another is a follower of Rabbi so-and-so, and they were called as disciples. And you had people at different levels of discipleship, different levels of their commitment to be a disciple, a disciplined follower of that rabbi. And so when the Bible uses the term disciple of Christ, it can mean anyone to anywhere from the immediate 12 to there's a group of 70 that Luke tells us about that followed him around regularly. And then there's a large crowd that is often called disciples in a very general sense. So understand that you have to kind of realize from the context which type of disciple he's really talking about. Well, here he's talking about these disciples that are committed, ultimately committed followers of his. And we're looking at how he called them and their response, because what we're going to discover is he's called us also. And so from studying how he called them, what he called them to do, and how they responded, we can learn together what he's called us to do and how we are to respond, because that's the journey that we're going on together. He's called us to follow him. And I can't tell you where that is and where that goes, because as we learned at the very beginning, he didn't tell them either. He just said, you, come follow me. And then they had a choice of how they responded. And the thing we looked at is the amazing thing is they left everything immediately and just followed him. We see in this account with Peter and Andrew and Peter, they in both cases, they not only left their business, they left their family and followed him. Now, there's some evidence they had continuing contact with them, but they left their livelihood, they left everything immediately to follow him. We looked in Mark's account, and we saw how Jesus approached a tax collector, actually out collecting taxes, and he said the same thing to him. He said, you follow me. And Levi, who then becomes Matthew, leaves everything immediately and follows him. We look at, why would somebody do that? Why would somebody just leave everything and follow this man without any explanation? Because we saw Jesus was not calling them to form a movement with him. He was not calling them to join a church. He was not calling them to adopt a set of beliefs. He was calling them into a personal relationship with him to simply follow him. And we looked at that word follow, and that means it's so simple it excludes everything else. All we have to do is know where he is and where he's going and go with him. And that's following him. And it's so simple, it's so profound, and yet it's so difficult because we're so used to planning and thinking and doing all kinds of other things that get in our way of just following him. And that doesn't mean we can't plan our lives, but we have to make room for simply his interruptions of come, follow me. And then we looked at, well, why would somebody do that? And we looked at, first of all, well, the authority of who it is that says, follow me. That he was the Christ, the Son of the living God. This was God standing in front of them, telling them, you follow me. So their response, first of all, was to the authority of who it was that was calling him. And then we saw the last time, what else about this man that would cause them to leave everything? That this man that loved them was the one that God had designed for them to live. We sang a song about come to the water. Jesus uses water as an example when he talked to the woman at the well in John chapter 4. He says, you've come here for that kind of natural water to satisfy your thirst during the day. But if you knew who I was and asked of me, I would give you living water, water that would satisfy your innermost desires, your innermost need, and it would become to you a source of that water on the inside, springing up to satisfy. So this Lord that's called us to follow him is not only the Christ, the Son of God. He's not only the one that loves us more than anyone can ever possibly love us, but he's the only one that can satisfy the deep inner needs. A relationship with him is the only one that can satisfy the deep inner needs and longings of your soul. And that's what we've looked at. Now today we're going to begin to look at how do you answer that call? Because a call has to be answered. No answer is an answer to not pick up the phone. We're living in a day and age where there are all kinds of people that try to call us and have access to us, from your closest relatives and friends to those robocalls, I guess they call them, or the telemarketers that are calling. And we have this wonderful technology now called caller ID, where you can see who's calling you. Of course, these telemarketers have gotten clever now. They'll pay for local numbers to call you, where it looks like, well, that's my own exchange. I'm going to pick it up, and then you get this. I love it when I answer, because they don't look at your name ahead of time, and when you answer, they look at your name, and they don't know how to pronounce my name. Hello, Mr. And I know immediately it's a telemarketer. But my point is this. We can look at it and say, I don't want to answer that call. But that's an answer. That's an answer to say, no, every call automatically elicits some kind of answer. And Jesus is calling his disciples, and we're going to see either today or next week that some of them answer by saying no. And we'll see a little bit of that today. So we're going to begin to look at this answer and how they answered it, but how is it answered generally? So to do that, we're going to look at some very difficult scriptures here today. Matthew chapter 22. Matthew 22. There's some verses in here that troubled me because I didn't understand what they meant and how they applied. And we're going to discover these together. Now, you understand the context here of where Jesus is when he's writing this. He's just entered Jerusalem with his triumphant entry, which we celebrate on Palm Sunday. So the city is giving accolades. This is the Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And they're crying out to him. And now Jesus is in this last week before his passion, and he's preparing them. And one of the ways he prepares them is by telling them a series of parables. Jesus, most of his teaching was in parables. And the reason he taught in parables, he explains with a parable, which is the parable of the sower. And that is, Jesus did not force his teaching on anyone. He laid it out like a buffet of food, so that whoever responded would get as much as they wanted. And he still works the same way today. So he would tell stories and interesting parables, and these were one of the reasons is they were very simple stories that contained very deep and profound spiritual truths. And Jesus did this because in the story, people can relate to the story. They get involved in the story. In fact, our media does that. They're teaching you all the time, but they're doing it with movies. They're doing it with TV programs because we use our imagination and we get involved in it, and we don't realize that we're being taught things, not by doctrine, but by example. That pictures are getting planted in our mind and principles are getting sown into our mind. So you need to be very discerning of what you watch and where it's coming from, because something's being sown in you. And not everything that says it's Christian is Christian. Not everything that is Christian is necessarily what you need to sow in your heart and in your mind. And so Jesus taught in parables because in a simple story that they could relate to, he would make a spiritual point that was powerful. And these stories were spoken in the cultural understanding of their day. So most of them are agricultural. Most of them have to do with sowing and reaping and principles that they were very much aware of because they operated in them every day. And so he's teaching them, but there's a series of parables here he's been sharing with them. And the message of all of these parables is to get them ready, to prepare them for something that is to come. Because God is a loving God, he wants to prepare us. A loving father will prepare his children for what it's like to go out into the world. And so he doesn't just want to make them feel safe and secure, he wants them to be prepared and to be ready. And Jesus is doing that with these parables. So you need to understand that, because the parable we're about to look at this morning sounds kind of difficult, but he's trying to awaken them and get them ready for something. That's the underlying story here. And so we'll begin with verse 1. We're going to go down through verse 14. I'm going to read down through it and then we'll explain it. And Jesus answered and spoke to them again by parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who arranged a marriage for his son. And he sent out his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding, and they were not willing to come." So when he calls them, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about being called. So here's a group he called, he invited. That was the call. In this case, it was to a wedding, and they were not willing to come. And again, he sent out other servants, saying, "Tell those who are invited, see, I prepared a dinner. My oxen, my fatted calf are killed." In other words, the reception's all paid for, and it's ready. All things are done. Come to the wedding. But they made light of it and went their ways, one to his own farm and another to his own business. In other words, they did not recognize the seriousness of the invitation. And the rest seized his servants and treated them spitefully and killed them. And when the king heard about it, he was furious. He sent out his armies and destroyed the murderers and burned up their city. And he said to the servants, "The wedding's ready, but those who are invited are not worthy. Therefore go into the highways, and as many as you find, invite them to the wedding." So those servants went into the highways, and they gathered together all whom they found. Look at this, both good and bad. And the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he saw a man standing there who did not have on a wedding garment. And he said to him, "Friend, how did you come in here without a wedding garment?" And the man was speechless. And the king said to the servants, "Bind him up hand and foot and take him away and cast him into outer darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Now that sounds very severe. But look at verse 14. This is what we're going to talk about. "For many are called, but few are chosen." So the thing we need to begin to look at now, we've looked at the call, but now we're looking at the response. And Jesus is saying here, although the call goes out to many, only a few are chosen. We don't like that, because we want to think of God as arms are open to all, to love and receive all. And they are, because many are called, but few are chosen. That used to trouble me, because I'm saying, why would a king call many and then only choose a few? That just doesn't sound fair. Well, therefore, I must not be understanding it. And what I've learned a long time ago is when I don't understand something, I go to the Holy Spirit who wrote the book and say, "I don't understand it." Amen. And by the way, there's still things I don't understand. 41 years of walking with the Lord, there's still things I don't understand. I said, "Lord, I don't understand this, and I'm not going to teach something I don't understand, so you need to give me some understanding of it." And I felt led to, all right, go back and read the context in which this is being written. The context is Jesus is talking about being ready for when he comes back. There will be a day of final judgment when what we've been called to do will stand in light of the judge of all mankind, of the men's hearts and men's intentions. And Jesus is telling them there, you need to be ready. There are other parables he gives of the virgins, the 10 virgins that were wise and the 10 that were foolish. The difference was the one that were wise were prepared, and the ones that were foolish were not. It's not like it snuck up on them and they didn't know it was coming. They didn't take seriously the call and what the call meant. So let's go back and look at what can it mean that many are called, but few are chosen, and what do we need to learn from that? I'm glad you asked. All right, let's go back to the beginning. Verse 2, the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who arranged a marriage for his son. Now, we could draw a parallel to that, to what the book of Revelation talks about, the marriage feast of the Lamb. When the bride of Christ, which is the church, there's some people don't agree with that, but they can be wrong. The bride of Christ has this marriage feast with its bridegroom, which is Christ. And he sent servants out to call those who were invited to the wedding. Now, there's two levels of meeting here. What he's addressing this to Jews. And so what he's directly referring to is when God created Israel, which he did through Abraham and a nation, God called this nation to be special to him. God wanted to display, I don't have time to go into all the ramifications of this, but why would God choose a special people? Because God wanted to reveal to the world what he was like. And the greatest way to reveal somebody and what they're like is through a relationship. God wanted to display what he was like, and God wanted to do that by having a relationship with a particular nation. So God didn't choose a nation. God formed a nation for himself. So he could start it from the beginning with a relationship, and he chose a man, Abram. Called him to leave his country and his family, and God entered into a covenant relationship with him, and then after him through his son Isaac, and after him through his son Jacob, and then through the 12 heads of the tribe of Israel. So God chose this people to be special to himself, not because he wanted to exclude everybody else, because he wanted the world to know how generous and loving and kind God is by how he treated this nation. And that's why he placed them in Palestine, because at that time, Palestine was the crossroads of trade between the East and the West. So the traders from the West would go into the riches of China and of the East and come back thinking they had seen the wealth of the world, only to see how God, the head of the king of Israel, had blessed his people. That was God's plan, but Israel did not follow and did not obey. So God called them first. Now God sees the end from the beginning, so God knew what was going to happen. If you read through Romans 9, what happened is God presented his son, the Messiah, to them first. John chapter 1, he came unto his own, and his own received him not. That's the Jews. They rejected the Messiah. And so God then takes the Messiah, and whom the Jews have rejected, and now God brings them to the Gentiles, which most of us, it's where we came from. But if you look at Romans 9, God's doing that to make the Jews jealous, so that in the end they will receive the Messiah as they see God's relationship with Gentiles through the Messiah. So that's God's plan. So here, the very first application here is that the people that had an invitation sent to them were the Jews. And notice their first response was, verse 3 says, he sent out servants to call those who were invited to the wedding, but they were not willing to come. They just didn't want, they weren't willing. Notice their will was involved. No, I don't want to come. Now there's a second level of calling here, and that's in our day and age to the world. So many are called, but many just say no. It was a beautiful day this morning. I got up, I was early, so I was taking Molly for a walk. And I'm walking past people who are loading their car up to go to the beach and loading, they're getting ready for their summer activities on this beautiful day. And you got to be tempted not to judge them, because we're not called to do that. But to recognize it's because they don't understand what we understand. You're here today because you have a reverence for the God that created you. You're here, your presence here today is acknowledge that I am not the God of my own life, that God, my breath, my hope, my life comes from a God, and I have chosen on this beautiful day to come in and to spend this time together worshiping him and acknowledge who he is. And you said yes today to that call. They said no, in many cases because they haven't heard yet. But they're saying no to the call. So it applies in that area. But it goes on to say in verse 4, and again he sent out servants saying, remind them, tell those who are invited, say, I prepared a dinner for you. My oxen, my fatted cattle are killed. They're ready to go. Now this refers to the Old Testament prophets. That God sent prophets to his people. God didn't just tell them through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God sent prophets to remind them, to correct them, to draw them in, to plead with them. And not only did they reject the prophets, they killed them. And that's what he says here. But they made light of those and went their own ways, each to his own farm and to his own business. They didn't pay any attention to the rest, seized the servants and treated them spitefully and killed them. But when the king heard about it, he was furious and sent out armies to destroy the murderers and burn up their cities. And then he said to the servants, the wedding's ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Therefore, go to the highways, and as many as you find, invite them to the wedding. That's us. That's the Gentiles. So send the call out to another level of people. So the servants went out into the highways and gathered all whom they found, both bad and good, and the wedding hall was filled. So that refers to those that have said yes, they've come in, they've spurred the word, they've responded to the call, say yes, I want to answer that call. But now you have this troublesome one guy. Notice he called those that were good and bad. Those that were good and bad. I've heard people say, well, I really can't give my life to Christ. My life is a mess. Well, that's the very one that needs to give your life. If you're going to take a bath to get clean, do you take a shower first so you're clean enough to get in the bathtub? You get in the bathtub because you're dirty. You come to Christ because you're dirty inside. And we all are. There is none righteous, no, not one. Our righteousness is but filthy rags, the Bible says. So the hall was filled with guests. Verse 11. But when the king came in to see the guests, he saw a man there, verse 11, who did not have on a wedding garment. And he said to him, friend, did you come in here without a wedding garment? And the friend was speechless. And this is strange. And the king said to his servants, bind him up hand and foot, take him away, and cast him into outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. Wow, this is a touchy king. You talk about a dress code in church. We went through this whole thing several years ago. It was okay for me to take my tie off. And there's still some people that aren't happy with it, and I understand that. But I got comfortable like this. I like this. But this is the ultimate. He doesn't have the right clothes on. It wasn't that they said, no, you can't come to church. He has him bound and cast into utter darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. What's that all about? Well, sometimes you need to do a little research, a little study to find out what this is about. To do that, we have to understand the Eastern culture in those days. A wedding back then was not like our weddings today where, it may be an hour or so, and there may be then a reception for a few hours, and then it's all over with. Very often, these weddings went on for a week or more. And people would come and they would gather, and there would be a lot of preparation. There's a whole ritual that they went through about bringing the bride to present her to the bridegroom, which when we get into the parable of the 10 virgins, we'll see more clearly. But one of the practices was there were certain clothes that were called wedding clothes. And from the research I've done, in most cases, the host would provide those clothes. Because remember, what we're looking at now is answering the call. And we're looking at the response of different groups of people when God has called them into a relationship with Him. So we see the Jews, first of all, said no. Some of them, when they were representatives sent to them again to remind them, no, you're the ones that were invited, they just paid no heed to them because they were not interested. They were busy or going about the own affairs of life. It just didn't matter to them that they were called by the king to his son's wedding feast. And then he goes and calls the others that were not part of that covenant relationship. And most of them come, but there's this one man that comes, but he's going to come on his own terms. That's what we're going to look at. He doesn't like the fact that he's got to wear garments that the king has provided for him. Remember, the king's provided them. He doesn't like the fact that he's got to wear those. Maybe they're confining to him. Maybe, and we're going to see it, possible reasons why. The thing about the wedding garments is they expressed respect for the bride and the groom. They were chosen to be respectful, to be celebratory, to recognize the solemnity of the event, and they were chosen to be festive, and they were to be respectful for the host and respectful for the groom and for the bride, and to represent that this was a place of celebration. And they were given to them. You notice they had good and bad coming, so even the bad people got wedding garments to put on that the king provided. Some of you are ahead of me already. The garments were provided for the guests. The king, now listen carefully, this is what's so important here. The king decided what was required clothing to attend the wedding. The king decided what was appropriate clothing to attend the wedding. We're talking about how we answer the call. And what we're going to see, I'll give you a little clue, we're going to see you cannot answer it on your terms. I've said, I haven't said it in quite a while, but I've said many times when I give an altar call, the truth is narrow and it's exclusive. We live in an age where toleration is the byword. And I drive past churches all the time that said God's doors are open to everyone. And they are. That God's doors are open to everyone, regardless of your race, creed, age, economic condition, regardless of your sexual orientation. God's doors are open to everyone. But God's truth never changes.